Good evening, everyone. I'm Gareth Mahan of the Van Allen's Institute's Program Leadership Council and principal of RKLA Studio Landscape Architecture. Welcome to this evening's event, Person, Place, Thing, with Justin Davidson. Justin, the architecture and classical music critic for New York Magazine, has been making the rounds for the last few weeks, talking about his latest book, Magnetic City, A Walking Companion to New York, all about exploring our city's arteries. And we couldn't think of a better fit for our current spring festival, Arteries NYC Circulation, than exploring the main streets and thoroughfares that shape our everyday urban experience. And I encourage you to join us for more events later this week, including Gowanus Triple Bypass, a discussion presented with the Brooklyn Historical Society, where experts from art, environmentalism, and real estate will offer a better understanding of the forces redefining the Gowanus neighborhood in Brooklyn. Urban Nervous Systems, a fast-paced lunchtime conversation at the new South Street Seaport Hub of the Black Gotham experience, where participants are invited to talk back with their impressions of how street kiosks should look and feel in the future. And finally, Redistricting, a non-sightseeing tour. It's our last hurrah and a celebratory roving variety show on top of a double-decker bus tracing gerrymandered lines in Williamsburg. Should be a fun event. Tonight, we'll enjoy Justin Davidson in conversation with our longtime collaborator, Randy Cohen, of Person, Place, Thing. Justin and Randy will discuss a person, a place, and a thing that have influenced Justin throughout his impressive career. So, without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Randy Cohen.
We're recording for broadcast this evening. What else? There'll be Q&A at the end. Because we're recording for broadcast, during the Q&A, I'm afraid the no cursing rule is in effect. I'm as sick about it as you are. It's the FCC. My hands are tied. I don't mean to look at you in particular. What else? From time to time, I'll say something innocuous like, we'll be right back. If you check the agreement you signed when you came here tonight, we have the right to read all your email. And when I say that, you're legally obliged to applaud like lunatics. Again, my hands are tied. I'm sorry about it. The good news is you don't have to mean it. It can be that kind of sarcastic applause that means he's just a jackass. Because on radio, it will sound as if you really like me, and that's all I care about is surface. What else? We always like to begin the show with music, because it is a show. And to whip you into a frenzy of conversational receptivity, Alicia Svigals. Do you usually work with a band?
I don't go anywhere without a klezmer violinist.
It's great. I could see why not. It's great, right? So, Justin, who's your person?
So I will answer your question, but I'm going to do what in the
Whenever anybody says that, that means I will answer your question eventually.
Exactly. I'm going to do what in the trade is known as burying the lead. So I have a little preamble. As a critic, I read a lot of criticism. And what I found over the years is that what I really respond to is not so much connoisseurial criticism, which I think of as comparing different people who do the same thing, which one is better or which wine is better and which is worse, but rather criticism that tells you something about an artistic experience that really goes beyond what that experience is. So I just want to read you a few sentences from a piece that really struck me. This is, I write about architecture and music. This is about art. Sooner or later, we all need to shut down or run away for a little while. Our frenzied, image-strobed, media-glutted existence demands the occasional dose of voluntary boredom. But the Guggenheim's Agnes Martin retrospective suggests that escape can become another kind of imprisonment. Entering the exhibition feels like stepping out of the world and into a sensory deprivation chamber. Outside, wisps of music and children's tumult ricochet off the sun-speckled trees of Central Park. Inside, all is sepulchral silence. Chaste canvases advance one after the other along the spiral ramp, a parade of parallel lines, right angles, and shades of not quite white. Martin used this ruthlessly reduced simplicity to find freedom from life's hoarse thrum. Whether you will too depends on what you are fleeing. And later on in this piece, it refers to the interpretation of Agnes Martin's very spare style as a kind of landscape, which is the way that she invoked it. But the piece also says, and yet to my eye, she is at one with the modern metropolis. After a few hours' immersion, I began to detect her spirit in the monochrome regularity of ventilation grills, tiled subway stations, receding stairs, storefront shutters, and so on. She seemed to have brought forth a whole cityscape of shimmering grids. Now, to me, that kind of piece which relates one experience, which is communing with art in a museum, to the city beyond, is kind of what I'm always trying to do, is find these relationships. So this is a piece of criticism in the Financial Times by their art critic, Ariella Budick, whose career I've been following for some time. We were colleagues before she was at the Financial Times and I'm at New York Magazine. We were colleagues at Newsday. But our relationship actually goes back well before that. We knew each other in college, and we spent a lot of time talking, in college about art and, as you do in college, and, literature and so on. And
We
eventually
just talked about beer, but I admire that.
Well, beer too. Beer first, klezmer violin second, and then came the art and philosophy. So eventually we decided that the only way we could really keep those conversations, those very fruitful conversations, going was, and this is where bearing the lead comes in, was for us to get married. So she is actually my wife and has been for more than 25 years.
I'm afraid there are conflict of interest rules here that forbid the guest from discussing someone he's seen naked. I don't mean to presume about your marriage, but all right, if you must.
I thought about those FCC rules.
Well, it's complicated doing this. It's a web of laws that binds us. So when you first met, did you envision that you would both end up being critics?
No, homeless people.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't really think too logically or rationally about the future. So far, it's worked out. But, I think that kind of conversation that's really been going on for all these years is really, has enriched my work immensely. I hope it's enriched hers, because it's this real back and forth where we deal with different disciplines, and we always have, but always in light of each other's work, and that ability to see one thing and see those relationships, like I can't do that by myself. And so it's always been important for me to sort of have an observation. It's also more than that. It's the ability that to relate those observations to an argument. I remember back in college, I would write a paper and she'd look at it and it was like, well, there's some nice points here, but you're not actually saying anything. And she still says that sometimes. And that discipline of, building up a set of observations and turning those into kind of a lawyerly, making a case and having a through line, is tremendously important. And it's really helped me to construct what are basically, the passing observations of walking around the city into something that could be an article and a chapter and eventually a book.
So do you hear her voice in your head when you're constructing your piece, that you're trying to, as if you were trying to persuade her?
Well, now we have the technology that allows that to happen, but even before, yeah, I mean...
Wait, are you talking about the telephone?
No, she just beams what she says.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing one of these events a couple weeks ago, and somebody I don't know very well, but who's in her book club, and has sees her once a month, said to her afterwards, he sounds exactly like you. Now I don't actually think that's true, but clearly
but it shouldn't be, should it? I mean, shouldn't it be Laurel and Hardy, or Leopold and Loeb, depending what kind of day you're having, and where because if you think what she thinks, then one of you is superfluous.
No, the process is often one of argumentation.
Right. So you don't sound like her. It's two very different voices, at least at first.
Yeah, I mean, there are things that we find ourselves getting into, especially about the city. She's a lifelong New Yorker. She grew up in the city. I didn't. And so, there are these things that people in the city are always debating, right? Is a new business better than the old one that went out of business? Is the city getting worse? Is it getting better? And so we often find ourselves on opposite poles of whatever that argument is. Sometimes we switch. But in the process is just one of kind of hashing it out. And what I found is that, it really makes you think through what it is you actually have to say, which has always been, a source of strength.
Will you buy this idea then that thought is essentially a social act, that it's something you do with other people? It's a kind of vestige of romanticism to picture some scholar, some critic, sitting alone in some garret having ideas, but that's not how we think. We think with other people.
Especially when you're thinking about cities. Because,
why,
I think
why
that's
do you say
probably
that?
true of anything, but about cities, because cities are such complex and really unknowable systems. Even to call it a system is maybe too rational. It's it makes you think that everything that there's an input and a predictable output, and I don't think cities are like that. But certainly everything, there isn't a moment of living in the city that isn't negotiated. I mean, literally, cross the street, or go up a staircase from the subway. It's okay, who's going to be holding on to the banister? Who's going to go around? Excuse me. The nature of city living is this constant interaction. So certainly, I can't think about a city, certainly a city like New York, in the abstract. And so that conversation is always an important part of that.
Is part of this that her experience of the city will be very different from yours?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, her view is longer, having grown up here, and I've relied on that tremendously. There's a chapter in the book about the Upper West Side, which is where she grew up, and in which I reconstruct literally a series of the businesses along a block that she remembers, that I don't. But it's I remember from 87 to 88, there was, chock full of nuts and this and the candy store, and she can remember every single business that was there for that period. None of them are there now.
She could be, just making all this up.
I've checked.
Damn you, Justin.
This is a very well-documented city.
I don't like gushing over the guests, and so enjoy this next 10 seconds. That one of the things I really enjoyed about your book that seemed very different from, say, Paul Goldberger's The City Observed or the AIA Guide is you're not just writing about buildings, you're writing about the history of those buildings. Sometimes who lived in them, what kind of lives they had, sometimes how they affect the other people who walk down that block, the laws that govern them. That made it really rich and interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that there's no cities. New York certainly is never static. And so you can't just look at a building and look at what it is. You can only look at it in terms of what it was, what it's becoming, and how it's aging, how it's being patched up. It's tempting when you see a building with scaffolding in front of it to pretend the scaffolding's not there. But that is, of course, part of the layered history of the city. And so every business that's been in a place, every store, every person who's lived there, has accumulated into this population of ghosts. Sometimes living ghosts, sometimes long dead ghosts. But the city is richest to me when you feel all of that happening, and then you can break it down. I mean, to me, what I really wanted to do with the book was to bring the reader to a given street corner and say, look around. You're seeing the way the city is right now, and you live that moment very intensely, right? Somebody's jostling you, the light's changing, the noises are there, but all of that is this moment in this really endless continuity of moments that make up life in a city. And you can feel and you can break down and you can research what led all of those people and all of those buildings to that particular lived moment and where it's going or where it might be going.
I like also that those moments are both great public moments in the grand historical sense. George Washington walked down this corner, and extremely petty and intimate moments like, and I had a fight with my girlfriend right there. And it links you to public life and historical life in a very personal way.
Well, the thing that really distinguishes living in a city as dense as New York is that we spend a very significant amount of time in public, being observed by other people and observing other people. And you can't get from point A to point B without going out in public, being dressed a certain way, behaving a certain way. Most important, encountering other people who behave and dress and think differently from you. And that, to me, is the crux of living in the city. And even if those encounters are not necessarily really long or deep, sometimes they're very fragmentary and superficial, we do that in New York subconsciously almost. We just accept that walking any block is going to be a series of passages and encounters. And so that kind of public aspect of living in the city really distinguishes the urban life from many other ways of living in which, if you leave your property and your experience of the outdoors is to walk from your kitchen door to your car, and then you drive, yes, in public, but really in a kind of private cocoon, to somebody else's property where you get out and go into your office building or the mall or whatever, then that's a very different sequence. And that's much less public interaction.
Sure, and that's why we're morally and politically superior to anyone who lives in Houston, right? But it's true, and it's finally, I thought the key word to this is the car. You're sealed in a metal box, so as much as possible, you avoid encountering anyone who's in any way different from you, and that makes you a worse person, and it impoverishes your life.
I don't think I would go that far.
Yeah, come on, you would go that far, I think. That's why you live here.
It's why I live here.
It's not just different; it's better. It's morally better.
All right.
I want to bully you a little about this,
look,
but it's not. They're not just two different styles.
I think that the experience of being in public is an important one to American democracy and to the contemporary world. It's why the world is urbanizing. People need that experience so profoundly that it's moving millions of people and it's having huge economic impact. So I think that is a really profound thing. I don't think we should romanticize it. It's not, it can be worse. You know, it can go against a lot of traditions too. But it means that friction is part of our lives. And yes, I value that. And I value the randomness associated with living in the city. Because the thing about getting into a car is, especially now that, you know, everybody has a GPS so you don't get lost, is it's intentional. You take a given route from point A to point B, and you know what that route is. And the route itself almost doesn't matter. Yeah, we have this kind of romance of the open road, but really, as we all know, the open road, for most people, most of the time just means getting on the connecting road, driving to the next exit, getting off, making a left turn. And all of that becomes filler. And maybe you can enrich it privately by listening to the radio or putting on some music. But it's still, the journey really doesn't matter that much. And all the kind of friction there is, which is, you know, the friction of traffic and so on, is almost exclusively unpleasant. Whereas the friction of living in the city is much more complicated. Some of it's unpleasant, but some of it is the stuff of life.
I don't think we'll get a better ending than the stuff of life. So we'll take a moment and we'll be right back. Alicia Svigals. So Justin, where's your place?
So my place is in my hometown, which is Rome, Italy. That's where I grew up. And it's the Theater of Marcellus, the Teatro Marcello in Rome. And the reason I chose that place is that we were talking before about the layers of history that make up a city, but in New York and in most cities, the tendency tends to be we have a kind of a binary choice, right? Either we destroy something that's there or we leave it, right? If we leave it, we preserve it. If we destroy it, we put up something new. Rome doesn't or hasn't traditionally worked that way. If it's there, you put other stuff on top of it and around it. And the thing about the Theater of Marcellus is that it's an ancient Roman theater, which is still beautifully preserved. One reason it's beautifully preserved is that at the time when it was no longer really functioning as a theater, and therefore wasn't a cost-effective thing to maintain, it got recycled into essentially the foundations for an apartment building. And in the 17th century, Baldassare Peruzzi stuck a building on top of the Theater of Marcellus. And over the years in the 19th century, stores used the arches from the theater and just as a place to do business, and so the stores crowded it and houses crowded it. It became the Jewish ghetto that sort of moved up against it, so that it really kind of almost disappeared. It became like embedded in the urban fabric. Eventually, in the 20s, that was considered to be a sort of a sign of urban disrespect to a great Roman monument, and so to clear it, to make it more visible, a lot of that accretion of city was kind of wiped away during the fascist era by Mussolini. So the place that we see now and that tourists visit is this accumulation of eras, and you can see them all. They're all just visible. It's like archaeological, but really almost like geological sediments. It's a kind of irreverent preservation that I find a great way for a city to adapt. And if we lose that ability to be irreverent in preservation, I think we lose a lot, because then it becomes a binary decision, right? There was a point where it really did not make sense to pay to maintain an obsolete theater, right? In another culture, that would have just been torn down.
Well, the High Line comes quickly to mind.
Yeah, sure. Sure. I mean, we're seeing it now, and I think you see it in landscape, you see it in infrastructure, and it's an approach to building cities I think is incredibly valuable. It's environmentally beneficial because you're not just destroying something that's there and then rebuilding it from scratch. It's economical sometimes. Certainly it's economical if you think in the long term. And the High Line's a really good example because it was seen as something that was depressing property values and therefore needed to be eliminated. And then the turn came when it was clear that it was something that could not only bring a benefit but also have an economic benefit.
Yeah.
And I think that it's helpful to look even at sort of distant urban evolution, in antiquity, as a series of financial transactions, because that's really
that's New York
makes it
for
happen.
sure. Yeah,
but not just New York.
Architects are taught about the relationship of a building they'd like to build to the city. The building has to adapt itself to the city, but you're saying something that's completely the opposite of that the city has to adapt itself to the building.
Not only does it have to, but it can't avoid doing so. I mean, it's, an insertion into a city, especially a dense city, but really any, is like, pressing into a soft material or dropping a stone in a pond. It creates ripples and then kind of closes in over it. And the High Line again is the perfect example. I mean, it was clear from the beginning that the High Line was going to change the city around it, but not clear exactly how. And there's been already probably 2 stages of evolution both physical and also social, right? The kind of businesses, the kind of people, the kind of traffic through that area has changed enormously. It will change again. And every architectural intervention, changes the context as well as respond to it.
I can think of a couple other examples that I like. That the Norman Foster Hearst building, where the bottom 4 floors just sat there since 1929, right?
Right, and another one in a way is the old Huntington Hartford Museum on Columbus Circle, which
it's been ugly for generations in very different styles.
I suppose, but it's it was a building that had that was kind of an orphan, and it had a history, and it was a rich one, but it couldn't find a way to be adapted at that point in time, and but rather than simply tearing it down and starting from scratch, there was a kind of evolution around it. Now, you can argue about whether it was successful aesthetically or whether that was the best use, but to me, the approach, that kind of adaptive reuse, is really important. The ability, I write a lot about preservation in the book, but I'm rarely talking about preservation in the sense of buildings or historic districts protected by the Landmarks and Preservation Commission, right? I'm not talking so much about landmarks. I'm talking about the preservation of the fabric of the city that can so easily be neglected, where you can hardly ever make a really powerful argument for any one building. And yet, cumulatively, those buildings add to the authenticity, the identity of the city. So how can you take those buildings and make them make sense, rather than say, well, the best use for this block is, a 40-story high-rise, so that's what we're going to do.
Well, I like this. It's a kind of third way that preservation can make for a dead city, and tearing everything down makes for a soulless city. But is this not, so you give us a third way where you adapt to the city adapts and things change, but is this not then ultimately an argument against Lincoln Center, say? Not that we need one.
Well, this is another thing about the kind of evolution I'm talking about, is it all depends on what the moment in time you're looking about making that argument is. I would never make an argument against Lincoln Center now, because it's such an incredibly rich part of the city, and it's an important part of my life. I'm there a lot. I think it's contributed, economically, culturally to the life of the city, and it's now, as it wasn't, 15, 20 years ago, really busy all the time. There's programming year-round, outdoor programming, and so on. But if you step back to a certain point and say, well, do we think it's a good idea to eliminate an entire neighborhood and disrupt all of those lives, ruin a lot of those lives of the people who live there, in order to create a concert hall and an opera house and a theater? I mean, I think obviously from our point of view, the answer would definitely be no. Let's find another solution. To me, in a similar way that if you were in the 17th century, if you were looking at the Theater of Marcellus and you were focused on Roman antiquity and the authenticity of those buildings and the use, you would be horrified at the idea of putting an apartment building in the middle of it.
Right, but
and yet that becomes part of the city that we value.
Right, but where they have a lot of Roman ruins? Rome. That maybe that's an argument for not making that if the Theater of Marcellus were in, say, Brooklyn, it would be more urgent to preserve it. But in Rome, it's you can walk a block away and there's something equally beautiful and of equal historic significance.
But in recent, since World War II, that fact has turned Rome, central Rome, into a kind of frozen zone, into a museum. Because basically it's impossible to build there, and the city effectively stopped developing. And that is a great thing about Rome. That's one reason we like it. It doesn't really change. You go there and the same cafe is in front of the same church, and the same exact kids are sitting on exactly the same mopeds as they were there 25 years ago. They never age. And that's a wonderful that's a wonderful way to experience the historic core of Rome. Do we want to scale that up and turn New York into that? I think obviously not.
Right.
That's not the city we live in. That's not the city we want to live in. So the preciousness of every resource, it can be a curse as well as a richness.
Would you include this idea about letting a building evolve over time to something like Central Park? In two ways. I'm thinking both because that was not a vacant lot. As we all know, a lot of people were displaced in order to build that. And also when Olmsted designed it, he knew, well, you won't see what it's like now. You have to wait 50 years till these trees grow. Are buildings like that?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole fabric of the city is built along those lines. I keep thinking about the grid, right, which was laid out in 1811, the commissioner's plan that envisioned, what was then, by our lights, a pretty small town, extending up to 155th Street, and it was going to be, totally orthogonal, avenues going this way, streets going that way. But imagine looking at what was actually there and projecting that map on top of it. You got a big hill, and there's a farmhouse there, and the property line goes around in squiggles, and there are roads that have existed for generations, and there's a beautiful bay there. And you say, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to ram a straight street right through that hill, which means essentially leveling it and dumping the hill into the Hudson River or the East River. I mean, it's insane. And yet that is the way the city has evolved. But what that allowed to happen is what you're talking about, which is this kind of the grid, like Central Park, like many buildings, allowed the city to develop organically so that it could go through many, many generations and many ways of thinking about the city and still nourish all those lives. In a way that I think a very purpose-built building or a certain, glass towers, for instance, have a hard time doing because they become very inflexible. And so it's hard for them to age. And they can't be adapted easily to change. And that, I think, is a key aspect of the kind of architecture I'm talking about. It's what's built in is its ability to evolve over time.
I wonder if you would apply this to an individual building too, in this sense that, and someone correct me if I'm wrong about this, but isn't it true that in that Norman Foster Hearst building, like if you have an office there, you can't bring in your own lamp? That he laid down the law, and it's an inflexible law, and these are the lamps, because that's how he wants it to be.
Yeah, I'm not sure how long architects' dictates over furnishings really hold sway, because people,
eventually people are sneaking those lamps in.
I mean, I think that if you look, inevitably, to the horror of many architects, their buildings get inhabited. And they've got all these renderings with the nice little scalies and the no trees on the sidewalk, and then things happen, people mess it up. But to me, the richness of a city is how you mess it up, and can you mess it up and improve it at the same time?
I don't think I'm going to get a better outline than that. We'll take a moment. We'll be right back. I should mention that the next show we're doing is Thursday, not here, at the Center for Fiction over there. It's Joshua Ferris, he wrote Then We Came to an End. Great book, really dark, really funny, with Jim Shepard, another novelist. He wrote the Book of Aaron. Great guys, right? You coming? You should all come. Yeah, you're not coming. Next week, Paul Schaefer. The music director at, you're shaking your head like you were sure we were doing Paul Schaefer next week. Yeah, that'll be fun. It'll be really good. He's going to play and talk and play and talk. So what's your thing?
I just want to say I can't imagine a better musical interlude and counterpoint to this discussion than to have a klezmer violinist because, I mean...
Not just
yeah.
klezmer violinist, but Alicia in particular.
Yes, because it's in the same way I was talking about cities renewing and nourishing themselves and changing. That's what klezmer did, right? It's this collision of all these different traditions: Jewish liturgical music and Eastern European dances and Roma music, and then coming to the States and encountering jazz and all these other things. And that's how cities work, and it's a very urban kind of music when it comes to the States. So, thank you.
Justin, it's not by chance that she's playing tonight. And it's just like we're not pulling them out of a hat, But thank you.
I just want to make that clear.
All right. What's your thing?
Okay, so speaking of music, this is my thing. It's a stick. It's a stick. It's just a little piece of enameled wood. Sometimes it's made of plastic with a little cork handle. That's it. That's all there is to it. But if you hold it this way and kind of wave it around like this, it becomes a mystical wand. It's a conductor's baton. And I've written a lot about music. I've been a music critic as well as an architecture critic, and I was studied as a composer and guitarist. Did a little bit of conducting, but I've always been fascinated by conducting, the profession, the mystery around it. And the more I've learned about conducting, the more mysterious it becomes, but also the more admiration I have for conductors. There's a tendency to think that the guy who's up there, or increasingly the woman who's up there, there are some wonderful women conductors who are finally breaking into a difficult world to break into, and there's a tendency to think that when they're up there and they're waving this thing around, they're not really doing anything because the orchestra is just could be doing it by themselves, and that's true. But it's also not true. It's true in the sense that in many cases the orchestra really could play a lot of the pieces pretty much without anybody being there. It's not true in the sense that there's something that happens. There's a current that passes between the conductor and the musicians. So it's like it closes a circuit. And so the musicians can communicate with each other through the conductor. And the reason I brought this, even though we're not talking about music, we're talking about cities, is because I think about the degree of control that we would like to be able to exercise over cities, and that conductors can and can't exercise over orchestras, who, after all, are all playing presumably from the same score, and with a set of conventions that when we plan cities and build them, we don't have. We may have conventions, but we don't have a score. At least we don't have scores that we can all agree on, right? The Regional Planning Association may give us a score, a blueprint for the city's evolution for, the next 25 years or 50 years. The city may roll out a plan that's supposed to go into effect, and all of the renderings look really great. The governor tells us, okay, we're going to spend X billion dollars on renovating LaGuardia. You're going to be able to get in, get out, get there. Not so much, right? It doesn't actually tend to work out that way. So there's this constant illusion, which I think of as very analogous to the illusion of control that a conductor has, and I've experienced it a little bit, where you get up on the podium and you think, okay, if I do this, everybody's going to do exactly what I want. Now, that can happen, but in order to get there, there has to be a pre-existing relationship. I can't stand in front of an orchestra of people I don't know and instantly project onto all of those artists the picture that I have in mind of what that score is supposed to sound like. A great conductor can, even though that person's actually maybe doing exactly the same thing, right? Somebody, I watched, I don't know, I remember what's Juilliard Orchestra, Bernard Haitink gets in front of it doing a rehearsal, and he does this. And whatever was happening 5 minutes earlier is completely transformed. Now, you can't see that. And the only reason it happens is because he is who he is, and the orchestra all know that, and all of a sudden there's this kind of mysterious thing that happens. So the question is, how can you understand what happens in a city and understand the difference between that mechanism that happens in an orchestra and that mechanism that happens in a city? Is it really possible for somebody to say, okay, we're going to create a network of bike lanes, and then it happens? Well, yeah, sometimes it does. But it's kind of mysterious to understand when it does and when it doesn't. And it's not always just a question of money, but it's a question of how you do these things, and how many unpredictable circumstances and pressures. So just to finish this thought, like take it one more step, when you're conducting, as a conductor, you have a great clarinet soloist, and there's a clarinet solo coming up. And so you kind of pull back just a little bit to let that person do whatever it is they want to do that particular evening in that particular moment. And you don't know exactly what it's going to be. The notes will be the same, but you don't know whether it's going to, be incredibly poetic or just kind of rote, and the difference between those can be minuscule. But you just kind of let it happen, and then you go on. And there may be a moment of magic, and maybe there isn't. And, in a city, you want things to happen, but there's always that level of unpredictability and the circumstance that really kind of spins out of control.
But is that partly because we don't have a score? Who's the composer in this metaphor?
Well, yes, but I think that we sometimes make the mistake. Well, I shouldn't say it's a mistake. I think we often try to impose a score. So, and in a way you can't do without it. So people are always, we still live with this classic division between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. And Jane Jacobs was the person who basically wanted, in this metaphor, wanted the musicians to effectively make up the score as they were going along. Like, everybody play what you want to play, and beautiful music will emerge. And Robert Moses was the one who was like, nope, we're all obeying the original tempos, and we're doing it this way, and that's how it happens. And we live in a city that is the product of those tensions, and the scores exist. And we have a long history of trying to perform those scores with varying degrees of success. Sometimes they really work.
Well, I want to go with you with this metaphor as far as we can. I want to extend it until, I can feel like I have to go see my chiropractor. Yeah. But I think you're hard on a little unfair to Jane Jacobs. Like, she wouldn't say, well, we should throw fire codes out, or that there were a whole set of actual formal laws that she would completely embrace. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's another way of thinking about it, is that the score is the set of things that are allowed. Right. We have building codes, we have zoning, we have the landmarks laws, and basically all of those things provide a framework within which individuals, developers, architects, people who live there, businesses, pursue what it is they want to do. And I mean, there are analogies in music too, right? There are plenty of composers who don't write out every note. They don't write out every dynamic indication. What they do is they create a framework, and they say, for the next 20 seconds, improvise this way. And you give some kind of, use this kind of notes and so on. And they can do it with, immense scores, with immense orchestras, and produce effects that are cumulatively what they want without worrying too much about whether the details are exactly, reproducible each time. In fact, they don't want them to be reproducible. And cities are kind of like that. These sort of musicians would call them aleatoric,
Right, yeah.
scores.
So you lay out a whole set of border conditions, and then within those rules, people can do whatever they want. And if they put in a crappy public plaza, they can do even things we don't want.
Absolutely.
Right.
Well, I mean, the thing about the rules is that they are meant to prevent the worst, excesses. They are meant to kind of get everybody in line so that things can't get too bad, but they often wind up preventing the best possible thing, right? Because architects can't go beyond those rules, even if doing so in this case or in that case would actually produce a better outcome.
Right, that's why I couldn't build my kerosene-soaked cardboard building. My hands are tied. Can you think of an actual example of that where something beautiful and worthy was thwarted by these damned bureaucrats?
There's a kind of amazing book of which you may actually have talked about here, which is Unbuilt New York.
Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah, which is basically a compendium of things like that. Now many of them just make you blanch and like, boy, did we dodge a bullet. Things that like really went along pretty far, and then you think, how could anybody have thought this was ever going to be a good idea? But yeah, there were some things that you look at and think, maybe the city really would have been better. And also some things I think we're coming around to. I mean, if you look at the way, for instance, if you look at the Metropolis of Tomorrow, that Hugh Ferris book, and these kind of incredible Art Deco imaginings of a multi-layered infrastructure with transportation systems that are vertical and where cars and trains and people are all separated. I wouldn't necessarily advocate that as a whole city-wide thing because the city gets a lot of energy from mixing those things. But sure, like when we talk about protected bike lanes or a kind of bike superhighway or a bike, bridge, that's kind of in that spirit. I don't know that it was like rules that didn't allow that to happen, but circumstances did.
Right. Yeah. And I think most of in Unbuilt New York, it's there wasn't the technology to build the 2-mile-high skyscraper, or there wasn't the money to build certain things. That I don't think a lot of it had to do with the kind of rules we're talking about.
Well, I think that some of it is the interaction of rules and convention. Right. Mm-hmm. Building is always kind of last in technological advancement because you have to do it at such a big scale that you can't kind of experiment on large-scale structure a lot of the time. The technology is usually well, in hand by the time anybody's actually building a building, especially in New York. But, like one thing I think I would like to see, we're starting to see it in other cities. I've written a bit about this is contemporary timber construction, using CLT, which is, massive timber, but that's made up of smaller timber elements. So it's basically forestry provided timber, which is sustainable, rather than having to log virgin forests or log rainforests. And so it produces a market for that kind of timber that could then go back into forestry and actually be a virtuous environmental cycle. I don't see us building a lot of timber buildings in New York City in the near future. And the one that Shop Architects proposed near the High Line is got scrapped. And that's too bad because that's something that we should be exploring. It's odd to think that there's a new technological frontier in wood, but there is.
And I suspect there are working professionals, architects in this room that can fill me in on examples of things they wanted to do where they were thwarted by the existing web of rules. And we'll all rally at City Hall later, so give me your names. Will you take a few questions?
Sure.
Before we do, join me in thanking Alicia Svigals, and especially... I think someone will pass among you with a microphone. No one ever wants to ask the first question, but everyone wants to ask the second question. It's question physics.
So let's just skip right to the second question.
Yeah, could we please?
There we go.
You mentioned a few very interesting examples of adaptive reuse that you felt were so successful. Do you have an example of one that you think is a disaster?
That's a good question. Adaptive reuse that's a disaster.
I can think of one.
Yeah. Thank you for bailing me out there.
And it just came from a previous show. It's the Brooklyn Paramount Theater, which was an Art Deco jewel. Currently is the Long Island University Gymnasium. It is the most unbelievably gorgeous gymnasium you've ever seen, because it still has all that beautiful Art Deco ornamentation inside in their crappy gym. And maybe this is a victory for sport. I don't know, but it seems like kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, that, which reminds me, I mean, one of the kind of unresolved things in the city in terms of preservation has to do with landmarking interiors. There are very few interiors that get landmarked. And landmarking them just basically means that they have to get preserved so they can't be, so that whatever you do to them can be reversed. So if you look at the public spaces at the Plaza Hotel, for instance, and the commercial spaces, I mean, they're pretty terrible, but they're technically preserved in the sense that you can undo everything that's there someday. But in the meantime, we're living with, pretty subpar treatment of interiors. And, there are a lot of interiors, and then, well, we lose a lot of interiors, obviously, because they're not landmarked, but that's not what you were asking. I am a supporter of the High Line, but I can see all of the arguments that people would make that would say, preserving it really ultimately ruined it and ruined the whole neighborhood. I really think that's one of those cases where you can make an argument either way. I discuss this in the book in particular with regard to landmarking the historic district that became the Gansevoort Historic District, which was, the meat market. And I think that what happens is that adaptive reuse goes hand in hand often with preservation, with statutory preservation, right? With designating a historic district or a particular landmark. So that area was this area that was kind of rough and tumble, that was changing. The High Line was part of that. It had this history of, farther uptown, the art galleries and the, gay clubs. It had this sort of, and all of the meat business. It had all of this stuff happening at once. And the crux of it to me was, the restaurant Florent on Gansevoort Street, which was kind of this real, anti-establishment kind of place. And the guy who opened it and who ran it, Florent Marier, was instrumental in trying to get the area landmarked. And one reason he wanted to do that was he saw that, the success of the restaurant and everything that was happening around it was changing the neighborhood. So he kind of stepped in and was part of this landmarking process to try to prevent too much change from happening. But when you prevent too much change from happening to the physical structures, which is all you can do through the landmarking and preservation process, you often wind up changing what happens in those structures. And I would say that landmarking it actually became part of the process of change. And eventually that restaurant obviously went out of business, largely as a result of some of the forces that it set in motion. So it's not that the adaptive reuse itself was a disaster, but what happens is that the adaptive reuse and all of the process that goes into it also winds up changing the nature of what happens there. You can preserve the architectural character of a building or a neighborhood, and that often means changing the human character of that same building and that same neighborhood.
I was just going to say that I think the Limelight Church that used to be a club is an example of a catastrophe of reuse in its current iteration.
Hi, what advice do you have for young professionals who would like to become a critic in architecture and in music?
Well, my usual first response is prefer something else. My second is great. The main thing is just persistence and keeping at it. If you read like a 1,000-word article that I write today, and there's some phrase that jumps out, and think, oh, that's kind of nice. You got to remember that like I've written 1 million words before I get that are kind of behind that, and a lot of them really aren't that great. And it was just really a matter of kind of like doing it over and over again. Look, all of these things that we're talking about are kind of pretty terrible economic propositions. But the thing is that there still is kind of a demand for this, even if it's small. And a lot of times it's just, it's like any of these things, it's like acting or, whatever. It's just being there, doing it, getting better at it, demanding really a lot of yourself, just not being happy with that 10th draft and thinking, yeah, well, okay, that's a good start. But, say that to yourself rather than have somebody else say that to you. That pretty much wraps it up.
If no one else?
I
Perhaps
think we said everything there is to say, so nobody has, there are no loose ends.
I have a whole list of questions, but we've heard more than enough from me. Join me once again in thanking Justin Davidson.